like a scientific paper, and mathematics is not a science. I understand that. I'm going to say what a scientific paper, a quality, and science students are often taught this. So, Sergio, you may have heard this. Ashley may have heard this. There's this mnemonic that I've heard called IMRAD, which reminds you how a scientific paper should be organized. And IMRAD is intro, methods, results, and discussion. Okay. So this is a nice framework to use for your paper, because what we're doing is kind of scientific. I mean, the scientific process, it's not, you know, they're interdisciplinary between math and biology. In math, you don't tend to organize your papers this way, but we're doing as much science as anything else. So, oops. When I read your paper, so I don't think I have that. You can see my mouse though. Can you see my mouse? So when I read your paper, I think I said, this is an abrupt start. You just jump right in. And so I think it's important to have an introduction so you ease your reader into it. You could put an abstract there too, but you can always write the abstract last. It's good to write the abstract last. But what you wrote here could use an introduction, and an introduction is a way to bring your reader in and tell them what you're going to do, right? And so in a way, an introduction is a good thing to write almost last as well. The introduction can be kind of longish too, but say you got an introduction, and say this is your first section after the introduction. Well, you know, this might be an okay to have as part of the introduction too. This whole idea of you're identifying bat species. What does that mean? What does that entail? And how ideally, how would it work? And if you can talk about like the ideal of how would it work, then you can contrast how we're working and how what we're doing is not ideal. Like, for example, we don't have voucher calls, right? So we're working a little bit differently. So if you set up the ideal way of working and then how we work, that gives you an opportunity to talk about voucher calls, talk about a key we have, the thing that's published by Sonobat, and how we look at that and how we use that information. This paragraph, we start talking about our methods, how calls were recorded, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then this paragraph talks about how we record it, but then also how you start looking at the data, okay? So that's a lot to mush together. So it might be good to think about pulling those apart. Again, I'm still talking high level. We can talk through the details in a minute. In this next section, you start talking about classifying, right? Your first sentence tells you we're talking about classifying here. And there's a lot to be said about classifying and what does that mean? Are you talking about it in terms of just your hand process of identifying the species of bats, or are you talking about it in terms of the modeling? And I think in this case, you're talking about the identification of the bat species from the data you have. So maybe classifying might not be the word you want to use. You might want to keep that as a technical word you use with respect to the models. I'm not sure. I'm just thinking about this out loud. But this seems to be like a section on the, you know, identifying the bat. So if the previous section was about your methods, now you're looking at the data, right? And how are you looking at the data? And this is the section where you can identify what species you're looking for, what species you did identify, Why did you choose those species, or how did you realize those were candidates? Right, that's a good discussion to have, and you mentioned that, you allude to that in what you wrote. And then here in this paragraph, you're kind of getting to the nitty gritty, the data, where does it come from? What are the parameters? Here you've got some plots, but these plots, and then this is my marginal comment, these are spectrograms of, what's the word? They're not zero crossings. It's the zero crossing measurements that we're interested in using. And so these might not be the best choice of graphs to plot, but I will let you think about that. Then you talk about cleaning calls, and then talk about visualizing the calls after cleaning them. And then you start talking about the modeling here. All right, this is where you start talking about the modeling and what does that mean? So the way that what you've written is laid out in the order of the topics, it's great. It's exactly the way I would order those topics, right? I think you need to think about making sections, and then more fully exploring some of those topics in those sections. And then at the end it'd be a natural place to put a conclusions or a results paragraph that can condense what you said or what you did. Yeah. So I've just gone through the idea that it'd be good to section out your paper, because sections allow you to focus and they communicate to the reader what you're doing. They help you focus as a writer as well. Your progression of ideas seems very natural and very good. And so I don't think you have to move stuff around wholesale. So I think this is a good first attempt, first pass at the paper and the way it should be organized. So you want to look through some of the specific comments? Yeah? No? Yeah? Okay. I'll use it. Sightings. We never saw a bat. This was confusing to me. I know we talked about looking at bats, but I don't think we ever went outside and looked at bats and saw bats. So, yeah, I'm not sure what that meant. And if you think it's important to be in there, you need to write this in such a way that makes it clear why this is important, make it clear to the reader why it's important. Again, the word seen, right? It's natural as a human to use verbs that are about seeing, but just be careful. We never saw a bat. So idea of what bat species we have detected, we have heard, right? Use a sense that's other than your vision. And maybe that's what the sighting meant, the sense in which the word sighting is used, but it's a distraction. Made notes of what bats look like. Again, not sure what that means. And what the calls entailed. So this word entailed for me is a signature word of I want to sound smart, but I don't want to be specific. And so I wrote the word vague. I don't know what that means. And what the calls entailed. I don't know what that phrase means. So you can strike that. If it doesn't mean anything, if it's meaningless, just strike that phrase and the rest of the sentence holds up. You just have to fix that look like phrase, right? Some calls were of higher pitch and frequency. Pitch is frequency, right? So that's redundant. That's what I wrote there. Does that make sense? Now, maybe you meant loudness, and that is not pitch, that's amplitude. So just say what you mean, but this is redundant. And some calls were of higher pitch and frequency while others calls were lower. Well, be careful. A frequency modulated call is both high and low, right? So you need to be precise. You can talk about average pitch, but then that's got some technical interpretations too. Is it average in the sense of a stats mean, or is it average in the sense of average value of calculus? So the language is hard. These ideas are sticky. I mean, they're hard to work with. So here's the first of many times I use my abbreviation for passive voice. Some bats were able to be seen. Oh, that's like a double passive voice. So that's very weak writing in the sense that it has low energy. You could say some appeared larger than others. I mean, I just appeared again, larger. This whole sentence, maybe it should just be struck because we never really saw the bats. Lastly, the time of night the calls were captured. Yeah, we're kind of capturing them, but use the specific language. They were recorded, right? Narrow down what species we might be hearing and seeing. Again, the seeing. And then I ask here parenthetically or in the margin, how has time played a role in IDing a bat species, right? Because you're talking about time of night here. That has never come up in the conversations that we've had as a group. Okay, and if it has played a role, write about it, be specific. Now, if this is an introductory paragraph, you can use language that you're not fully defining or that's might be a little ways out of the grasp of the reader in this, if it's in the spirit that you're going to talk about it later, right? And if you can tell the reader you're going to talk about it later. So generally, and when you write in mathematics, you never use a term before you define it, right? You always define a term first, and then you can use it if it's a technical term. If it's a term that you expect everybody should know, then you don't have to worry about defining every term. And I think the same is true in science writing. If there's an important new idea that your reader might not be familiar with, you just make sure they're familiar with the idea before you start using it. So again, time of night, we never talked about it, but if you're going to talk about it later, and you don't, it's okay to mention it as long as you tell the readers that you're going to talk about it before. Again, sightings, I have a problem with that. So second paragraph, I put a little note here that insert in parentheses the manufacturer of the Anabat Swift. That's a typical thing that's done in a scientific article, especially like in a method section, where the authors are trying to help the readers identify where they got their supplies and equipment. So if they want to reproduce the work that the scientists did, they're making it slightly easier for them. So that's a good practice. And then if anybody in our case wanted to understand more about the Swift, they could do a Google search for Titley Scientific and get all kinds of information. You're just helping them do that. Next sentence, you say the detectors were placed outside. Be more specific. What do you mean placed outside? Of course they weren't placed inside. There are no bats inside. And it's complicated because you three placed your detectors in very different places. And it's perfectly reasonable for you to say, Mercado placed his in this kind of location. Skelton placed hers in this kind, right? I mean, it'll take up space, but you've got calls or you've got detectors that were in 3 different places. And if you roll in the walkabouts, that's all kinds of different places, right? And just lay that out. You got calls from all kinds of different places. And if you lay out in this paragraph that the 3 of you are recording bats from very different places, right? 2 of you are in Camarillo, 1 of you is in Simi. That's another source of variation, right? Which you talk about later. And you can say, we believe that our geographic location should not contribute to variation in the calls, right? If you believe that. Or you could ask, do they? Which is a good question. Here, let me pause for a second and just make sure you understand what these 1, 2s, and 3s and 4s are. Okay, is that clear what they mean? Right, so, oops. I'm trying to get my iPad started again. So at the end, I added some extra sheets of paper, and then I put these circled numbers down here. Just gives me more space to make a comment. I don't have to just work within the margin. So here I comment on sightings. Here, comment number 4 is I say you should say where you placed your detector, and then talk about the vicinity of the detector too, right? And you don't have to tell the reader why you're talking about how there aren't any leaves or whatever. Later, you can say, oh, we're clutter. You can use the word clutter or whatever. Okay. So is this helpful? Is this the level of detail you want me to talk about the stuff in? Okay. All right. In the morning, you really mean each morning, right? Because you had detectors out for multiple days. We uploaded the recorded data to Insight. And then I put in parentheses the next sentence because I want you to look at the whole thing. We then examined and sorted the call samples. I mean, should be call samples? Probably should just be calls or the recordings. And then you say, according to approximate frequency range. So I think you're giving the process short shrift. I mean, really, the first thing you did is you got rid of the junk calls. You looked for which recordings had a bat in them. And then for bat recordings that had bats in them, you set those aside and saved them. And then you'd go through a process of cleaning. So here in this sentence, you might say that you'd sort the bat recordings from the recordings that didn't have bats, and you deleted those. And then later you'll come back and clean the bat recordings, and you'll discuss the process of cleaning in section whatever, right? You don't have to describe it right here. You can just say, we'll describe it later. And then you can segue into, and this is kind of what you're doing here, segue into the conversation about parameters that Anabat Insight will measure. So you say the call date, time, and frequency modulation were compiled in a spreadsheet. So modulations, I put a little question mark there. And I say, we've got a technical term for this. I'm not exactly sure what that meant. So just be specific. Modulation means change. And the spreadsheet doesn't measure any of the doesn't have any of the changes in there. It has max frequency, min frequency, average frequency, and other crazy parameters that we haven't even talked about. So here I think it's another instance of choosing a word that's up here in the number of syllables and sophistication, when really just choose a word down here that's more specific, right? The most effective communication is simple communication. You should always try to be as simple as possible. Oh, what happened? So modulations, I think you can find a better word. Were compiled, passive voice, right? In a spreadsheet and compared. So I didn't catch this the first time. Compared what? Right? This is kind of hanging out there. Compared. You refer to figure 1, which is good. I like that cross-reference, internal cross-reference. That's good. But there's nothing in this figure that makes it clear what you're comparing, right? You've got frequency range here, approximate frequency range, which is not an Anabat parameter, an Insight parameter, right? Whoever wrote these numbers down had to pull them out of either the spreadsheet or visual inspection of the of Anabat Insight. So there's things going on that aren't being talked about, which is okay, but I'm just trying to point out a disconnect. Here it says the frequency ranges are all similar with a few outliers. And I wrote, do you still assert this? And this is unclear to me what it means. The frequency ranges are all similar with a few outliers. At this point, you haven't talked about species at all. And I think you're trying to say that between the species that we think we have, all the ranges seem similar, but it's not clear. There's a lot of unpacking that has to happen here, or you should just get rid of this because it's not in the right place. I'm not sure. I wrote still assert this because I think you spent more time looking at these data, and I think you agree that there are some of the bat species whose frequency ranges are very different from others, right? And when you look at those box plots, is there a box plot in here? I don't think there's a box plot in here yet. I know there's a box plot in some of your revisions that you shared with me. The box plots show that some of the frequency ranges are not similar. So just be careful about this. I think this is a wrong statement. The next sentence I didn't understand. The lower frequency ranges are separated from the higher frequency ranges. And so I write, this is confusing. You're talking about lots of numbers. To which are you referring? So is the min frequency range or max frequency and are separated by what? This sentence is very confusing to me. Okay, it needs to be clarified, fixed somehow. Oh, so show it. I see, wrong comment. This comment goes with something else here. This unclear sentence gets this comment, show it, box plot. If they're indeed separated, show me what the hell you mean, right? This is not clear. And a box plot can show that separation. Even if it's not a total clean separation, if the two boxes don't align, a lot of statisticians will say, yeah, those are separated, right? This group, their numbers cluster up here, and this other group, their numbers cluster down there. Even if their whiskers overlap, if those boxes don't overlap, then the statisticians will say, oh yeah, they're separated. But without that visual cue for what you mean, this sentence is almost meaningless to a reader. And then since two detectors have been placed in a private yard, those numbers are higher and show more variation in call range. So this word those, I think would technically be called a pronoun. And when you have a pronoun always refers to something, and that thing to which it refers is called an antecedent. Right now, the antecedent of the word those is not clear. What numbers are you talking about? So that's why this is confusing. You're talking about lots of numbers. Up here, call, date, time, frequency, modulation, whatever that is. To which of these are you referring? Okay. Now, when we've been talking, the three of us, we tend to talk about the max frequency and the min frequency. And we ignore all the others. We talk about max and min frequency because they're easy to see. And min frequency is because it varies less than max frequency, right? Attenuation doesn't affect min frequency as much as it does max frequency. But there are many other parameters out there, many other numbers in our spreadsheets. So when you say those numbers, it's really important to specify what you mean, and call range too. You want me to keep going? I feel bad. I feel like I'm like beating you guys up. But that's not the intent of this, right? The intent is to show you what a disinterested reader sees from the words, right? This is a great first draft, first run through, and it's hard to express these ideas, right? It's really, really hard. So I admire what you're doing, and I'm just trying to point out some things that it might be hard for you to see because you're so close to all this. Okay, so here I say, this figure accidentally included something from the journal. So this shouldn't be in there. That's not part of the figure. That's part of the journal it came from, but that needs to be cropped out. So that's what this comment is. Needs reconsideration. I don't know why I said reconsider this. Maybe it's just some of this stuff. I don't know. I think these images for these figures are better than the other ones you chose, these down here, right? I think cut these and instead use these. So I don't know what I was thinking at the time. So we began classifying, and here I am. I say, no, you didn't, right? I'm thinking classifying as a mathematical thing, right? But you probably meant it as you're just organizing and identifying species, okay? So that's probably me being just a little bit too snippy. So you say you've got a list of bats that inhabit Southern California, and then you have the citation down here. So if you're gonna use footnotes for your citations, and I don't really think you should, but it's a reasonable thing to do for now, is that write this out in proper citation format. Because then when we change it into an actual reference list, you can just cut and paste. Once we knew which species of bats we have recorded, we searched for scientific papers that describe the frequency range and characteristics of these bats. Well, later you talk about the sonobat thing, right? So here might be an opportunity for a little bit of moving things around. Here you say using this information. Well, what information? Maybe here would be a list, an opportunity to put in some papers, some citation to some papers that had that stuff you're talking about, the frequency range and characteristics of these bats. And then here you're talking about numbers for a big brown, and I say good place for a table, right? And that Sonobat handout, it's got some tables in it. You can just transcribe that into the LaTeX thing. And then I'm confused about this sentence here about its relevance. Yeah, it wasn't clear why this sentence was relevant, but maybe you just forgot to say that Betts's paper was about how these species can be confusing. You can confuse the calls between these two because their numbers are similar. And so if that's what you meant, then maybe you should include in your table that you'll put in here, right? Because I said good place for a table, put the numbers for all the species you expect to see, right? The big brown, the silver-haired bats, the hoary bats, the canyon bats, right? And then if the readers see a table there, you can say, hey, you can notice in table 1 that the calls of the big brown bats and the silver-haired bats are easily confused on the basis of their range of frequencies. And this was described well in Burr-Betts' 1998 paper. All right, so next I say grammar, some awkward language. Our recordings could easily be classified as big brown or silver-haired bats. Isn't that contradictory? It could be easily classified by into bats that are confused with one another. So I think I just objected to that word easily. Never make what you do sound easy unless you believe you're help making it easier for somebody else to do something. So passive voice, who recorded, how do you know they were hoary bats? After reviewing data and comparing the call patterns, what do you mean about the call patterns? Be specific. If you're not specific, people aren't going to be able to reproduce what you did. Or so people aren't going to be able to learn from you, and people aren't going to be able to critique from you. They're not going to be able to say, hey, that was a good idea. Or, hey, you guys really know what you're doing. Right here, the call patterns is an opportunity for you to make yourselves vulnerable to describe what you're doing, and either learn from getting feedback or teach the next people that what you did was good. And even if you learn in the future that you could have done something better, at least you've established a baseline from which you started growing. Right, and frequencies to a table found online, Sonobat. Well, you mentioned this before. Didn't you mention Sonobat before? I don't see it now. I thought you did, but maybe I'm mistaken. I'm lost now.
I think we referenced Sonobat. It's number 2 on the footnotes of page 2.
Yeah, here.
I think that is, yeah, that's the one
Yeah.
referenced.
Yeah, okay. More passive voice, jump in logic. Oh, and I think I made a comment somewhere where the bat's actually in the apartment. Here, the purpose of this first sentence in the next paragraph is unclear. Using frequency ranges to identify which bat species were recorded is a start, but more work needs to be done in order to identify these bats with greater accuracy. Yeah, and I think this is an argument I think you're trying to make in the previous paragraphs. So maybe the sentence should go with the previous paragraph or the conclusion of the previous paragraph. And then this next sentence, there would be a nice transition to the next paragraph if it started. Many species of bats have similar frequency ranges, including the western yellow bat and big brown bat, which hopefully would be made clear from the previous paragraph. Yeah. Then you talk about voucher calls, which is good. All right, but then you leave the reader thinking that you have voucher calls. Okay, so I think here, if you put in the fact that you know what a voucher call is, and then here you'd be able to use the vouchers calls to determine the bat species, but then somewhere you should say that you don't have voucher calls. I don't know if you say that. I don't think you say that. And voucher calls would be a good way to transition to what you're doing in the next paragraph is that, so here's where you start talking about making the model. Okay. So some small comments here. What was my comment number 9? Let's see what comment number 9 was. Oh, so comment number 9. Here it says the spreadsheet was then imported to MATLAB and classification analysis was completed. Oh, it's the previous here. Once all the reports were complete, we combined all species into one spreadsheet for analysis. So it felt to me like you were saying the analysis is happening in the spreadsheet, but in the next sentence you say, oh, MATLAB is where we're going to do the analysis. Again, some more passive voice happening here. Some of these comments are going to be self-explanatory. Here, as I was reading, I see this phrase represents a fraction of the variables, and I asked how many variables are there, and then in the next sentence you answered that. So it might be good to say earlier how many variables you have, right, and how many you actually used. The green comments here, there's inconsistency with the way you write MATLAB. Some people write it in all caps, some people write it this way in camel case. Just choose one. Doesn't matter what you use, just be consistent. And then here's an opportunity to use the idea of training a model. That's why I wrote that out here. So training and testing. And my comment number 10 kind of just explores that a little bit more. And then you mention a confusion matrix, and you could do a cross-reference to figure 7. You've done that before in your paper so far. But a general reader isn't going to know what a confusion matrix is. So you're going to have to help them interpret what this looks like. And I'd use the confusion matrix that has those other summary statistics in the right-hand column too, so you can explain all of it. And if you can connect it to type 1 and errors, I think that's always an interesting thing for students who have had some basic statistics. What else? I think we're getting close to that. So here you you name the 4 species of bat that you encountered. Well, this is the first place where you say the 4 species that you identified. I think this should go much earlier, right? And what would be interesting is if you listed all the possible bat species that could be around here, and then say that here are the 4 that you've concluded that you have, right? I mean, that would be interesting writing to me, interesting reading to me. And then I've got a comment over here in the margin. As I read these last sentences, I say, this is all, quote, coming in for a landing, unquote, language that doesn't quite work. That is, you're trying to wind down the paper right here, and you're using all kinds of general language that is almost like boilerplate language in a scientific paper, adjusted for this essay, this narrative. And so in that sense, it works. But I think it's too early. I think there's more stuff that you can say. And I think that, a lot of students are taught that when you're writing about your research, you should have a future work section, so people know what you're going to work on in the future, right? But I often read that and think that's bullshit. That student is not going to work on this project anymore, right? They're going to go off and do something else new, and that's perfectly fine. So when I see that, I'd much rather see a person write, the next student who takes on this topic, or the next person who does this, should be looking at these things, right? These are the questions they should be looking at. And here, these lines are kind of committing this sin that I don't like, but you're using the passive voice, so you're obscuring your role in the future and letting the reader fill in that this is stuff that you're going to do. I say, just be more direct about it. And who knows, the next student might be you, but yeah, don't feel like you need to commit yourself, because when I wrote that stuff growing up, when I was doing research, right, the next thing I'm going to work on, I knew that was inauthentic, and it made me feel bad. So, and personal writing is stronger writing too. And even when you're saying it's going to be the next person, I mean, that's stronger than saying it will be, yeah. Anyway, you get the point. I see you guys nodding. Yeah. So those are the thoughts that I had on your paper. If there's any theme, it's a theme of you writing a phrase or a sentence that actually has so much meaning in it that you need to expand on it to explain things, right? That just happens a bunch. And that's really natural. And it's hard to see when you're writing it. It's hard to know when you're writing it. And that's what we learned to do in the process of revision. So hopefully I've accelerated that process here for you a little bit by writing these comments.